record buttons in the bottom
yeah,
right of your panel.
All right, broadcast.
I just got a little note saying it's broadcasting. Yeah, and everybody's coming in. Yeah, okay, it's all. That's
okay,
great. It's working.
Yeah, it is working. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Just wait a sec, Miguel, just because there's more people rolling in.
Perfect. Oh, this is awesome. I see a lot of people.
We have a cap of 300, but we should be fine.
Okay. I just want to let you know, if you're already online, I just want to let you know that we're going to be waiting a couple more minutes until it's noon to start the webinar, Pulse of the Planet. Welcome. My name is Miguel Fernandez. I am the director of the Latin American and Caribbean programs for NatureServe. And I want to welcome you to this new edition of Pulse of the Planet. Today we have a very special guest, and we will wait a few more seconds to start this presentation. Please bear with us. Thank you. Okay, this is excellent. 51 attendees. This is excellent. Okay, we'll start shortly. This is an initiative led by NatureServe and supported by GEO BON and EcoHealth Alliance. And the goal is to spread the word and share the scientific activities of the network members. Welcome to Pulse of the Planet. If you're based in Latin America and the Caribbean, being part of the network is free. It's an open network. Just send me an email. Today we have as guest speaker, Mike Gill. He's the co-chair of GEO BON, and he's also the director of the Biodiversity Indicators Program at NatureServe. And it's an honor and a pleasure to give the floor to Mike Gill to talk us about biodiversity observations and how they can be leveraged to policy across the world. Thank you, Mike.
Great. Thanks, Miguel, and welcome to everybody. It's really great opportunity for me to spread the word about the work at GEO BON. Miguel, can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure before I start my volume's good.
Yes, we can hear you perfectly fine.
And can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, but I see all your slides.
So yeah, don't worry. Great. Okay. Thanks a lot, Miguel, and welcome to everybody. I probably just give you a little bit more overview of who I am. So I'm based in Eastern Canada in Nova Scotia. I'm actually giving this presentation from my friend's house because I just dropped my daughter off at the global climate strike here. And interestingly enough, at that protest, there was a lot of signs about biodiversity, which is nice to see that people actually care and see the link between climate change and biodiversity. So as Miguel mentioned, I co-chair GEO BON. So this is an elected position. I like to call this my night job. So this is, no one pays me to do this. I just get accolades or perhaps thanks at the end of the day. But it's a really wonderful opportunity to work with a lot of excellent scientists and other technical experts from around the world to build this global network. And my day job, as also mentioned, is I'm the director of the Biodiversity Indicators Program for NatureServe, which is really very part and parcel closely related to the work at GEO BON in terms of on a daily basis, we're always looking to access and deploy the best available biodiversity data to help inform conservation policy decisions. So what I'd like to do first is just provide a little bit of context behind why we developed this global network, GEO BON. And of course, none of this, I'm sure, is a surprise to anybody here on this call, but we just hear more and more in the media about the biodiversity crisis and just global environmental change, climate change. As mentioned, there's climate strikes happening all around the world today with millions of people. And we really are living in interesting times, if you want to put it that way, and through some cruel coincidence, perhaps. I was born in 1970, so my birth year is the baseline year that many of our environmental assessments choose. And so in my short life, so I'm 49 years old, but in the time that I've been on this earth, we've lost 60%, so 6 out of every 10 wild vertebrate species is gone from the planet. So of course, we're really living in the age of Anthropocene, where humans are having this massive outsized impact on planetary processes, including biodiversity. The Best Global Assessment just released a report a few months ago that says that we're set to lose about 1 million species if we don't change the trajectories we're on. And a very important issue currently at play, of course, are the fires in Latin America, not just in the Amazon, but in Bolivia, but of course, fires across the tropical biome around the world. And while we have great concern about this, and there's some indication that some of these systems might be reaching a tipping point where further loss of forest cover will become irreversible, we really don't know a lot about what we're actually losing on the ground in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem services and values to people and culture. So with all of these growing crises and just the outsized impact that humans have on the planet, of course, there's been a major policy response in the last 25 years. So we had the Rio Convention in 1992, which led to a number of different conventions being signed and ratified around the world. The big one that I work with is the Convention on Biological Diversity, but we also interact with the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. There's the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, Convention on Migratory Species, a number of different agreements that all demand action on certain aspects of biodiversity. And in every single case, that action is driven by a roadmap in terms of goals and targets. So all these conventions have goals, and they have targets that are designed to drive the nations towards some coordinated action. And in every single case, these targets demand data and indicators. So if we have no idea where we're going, we really can't have any sort of informed action. And unfortunately, just taking the Convention on Biological Diversity as an example, we have the Aichi biodiversity targets, which are set to expire in 2020. And only 6 of those 20 targets can we actually say with any confidence what's happening in terms of global progress towards those targets. So without being able to understand the direction that the world's going on these targets, we're basically managing blind. And the same goes for the Sustainable Development Goals, where we have 169 targets under the SDGs, and we're asking countries to track progress towards those, and yet they lack the capacity and the data to do that. Now, one thing about biodiversity that puts it in a unique position is that there's a growing understanding and awareness that when you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals around like zero poverty, zero hunger, no poverty, as well as the biological ones, they're all underpinned by the biosphere. They're all underpinned by biodiversity. We can't reach good health and well-being, so SDG Target 3, without actually maintaining a stable and regulated planet and biosphere. And there's lots of growing research that shows those intersections and those links. So with the Paris Agreement recently signed, that sets goals for a 1.5 degrees Celsius planet by 2030, the analysis shows that what we do to our ecosystems and our biodiversity plays a really key role in that. So essentially 37% of the target, and the models say, can be reached, the 2030 targets, to hold us at 1.5 degrees Celsius by conserving existing wild ecosystems and restoring degraded ecosystems in terms of improving the carbon sinks across the planet. And so there's a huge opportunity there to really raise awareness for not just the intrinsic value of biodiversity for humans and for nature shows or your tourism or whatever you want to call it, but this actually plays a core role in the regulation of our planet. And another interesting example here is just the links between biodiversity and zoonotic infectious diseases. Our friends at EcoHealth Alliance are leading the way on doing global analysis as well as targeted research to show that one of the biggest driver that can explain pandemic outbreaks of zoonotic disease is actually rapid land use change. And with rapid land use change, you see greater fragmentation of habitats and increased transmission potential of viruses to humans. And with increased transmission potential, you have increased virulence, which leads to these pandemic outbreaks. So maintaining stable, unfragmented ecosystems also actually has a role to play in how we manage human health and how we reduce risk to disease. And of course, governments spend billions of dollars every year on mitigating and minimizing risk to human diseases, but they still haven't really seen the link around actually maintaining healthy ecosystems. So with this outsized role that biodiversity plays in all aspects of our life, one would think that we would have excellent investments and a really great history of data. But of course, and I'm sure to no surprise anyone here on this call, biodiversity data really suffers many deficiencies. So we tend to monitor what we can see. So this top left graph just shows the difference between the red list assessment in terms of what we assess. So we generally are very good at assessing birds, a little bit less better at mammals and amphibians, and then most other taxa are not well covered in the red list assessment. But of course, the world is dominated by invertebrates. And so there's a taxonomic bias where we tend to know more about the things that we can see. Of course, there's impact and personal bias in terms of what we study. And a big one on the bottom left is just around spatial inequities in data. Not surprisingly, Europe and parts of North America have some of the best available data, although that's changing. There's many excellent biodiversity observation programs and research networks around the world now, but there's still an uneven spread of biodiversity data across the planet. And even in these areas, such as in Europe, where we arguably have lots of data, it's still not enough. And of course, a lot of our data is temporally restricted. So we have time series data for very few different animal populations and different metrics of biodiversity. And with that, and of course, the variability that biodiversity cycles through, we're really limited to be able to sort of identify that signal from the noise. And the final sort of contextual aspect to all of this is that unlike, say, several hundred years ago, because we live in the age of the Anthropocene, a lot of the major drivers of biodiversity loss and biodiversity change are happening at global or subglobal or regional scales. And climate change is probably the best known. And so it actually demands a coordinated, scaled effort for us to actually monitor, track, identify, and predict biodiversity change. There's no one country on this planet that has the resources to be able to go it alone in terms of being able to understand what's driving change in their own landscapes and ecosystems and biodiversity. The biodiversity drivers are fundamentally scaled that demands that we actually work together. And with all of that, that's really where GEO BON comes in. So GEO BON is the acronym for a long and awkward name. So it actually stands for the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network. So GEO BON's mission is to improve the acquisition, coordination, and delivery of biodiversity observations and related services to users, including decision makers in the scientific community. So basically, our goal here is to improve the amount of biodiversity data that's generated and available and improve the quality of that and deliver that to policymakers and decision makers, whether those be governments or local communities, to help them make better decisions around how to sustainably manage ecosystems and biodiversity. And we're what we call a flagship. We're one of 4 flagship programs under GEO. And if you're wondering what GEO is, GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, is an intergovernmental organization. It was set up in 2005, and it came about, started first through a discussion between the space agencies around the world, who basically started to say, you know, we're throwing these sensors into space, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these satellite systems, and we're not actually talking to each other. So there's a lot of redundancy in these sensors, but we're also not extracting the full value out of all these Earth observations. And so GEO came about first as an opportunity to really connect and create a global Earth observation system of systems, and really grew from that to not just focus on remote sensing, but also on ground networks. So how do we actually improve the coverage and coordination of biodiversity observation systems from space, from the air, and on the ground to extract as much value out of them? And so GEO has 8 what we call societal benefit areas. One of them is biodiversity and ecosystems. And the motto of GEO is countries have borders, Earth observations don't. And GEO is pretty much widespread and global in nature. So it covers 7 continents, as mentioned, 8 benefit areas. This slide's a bit old, so it's actually 14 years old now. We have 73 work program areas. Over 105 countries now are formal members of GEO, and on it goes, involving, and this is an old number, but at the time, 400 million Earth observations. And this is just a map. Again, this is 2 years old, so it's changed a wee bit since then, but showing where we have national members to GEO. Now, jumping back to GEO BON, this slide is just a small sampling of the different organizations that are partners. So we have over 200 organizations that are formal GEO BON members, and we have hundreds of different individuals that are part of the network. So of course, we have support from some key players such as NASA and the European Space Agency, but we also have some real leaders on this around different parts of the world. So the Humboldt Institute in Colombia leads on a number of core aspects of GEO BON for us. The same with CSIRO in Australia, the same with the World Conservation Monitoring Center in the UK. China as well is a really strong player in all this. And I'll stop there, but it just goes on and on in terms of the active members as part of GEO BON. And this is just, if you go to our website, you can actually scan. We keep track of our membership. It's important to note for all of you that you're all welcome to join GEO BON. It's an open network, and we can connect you into this. And with that, this whole GEO BON network is volunteer-based. We're focused on long-term biodiversity change. As mentioned, we're very open. We push for open access to data, but also just an open network in terms of everyone's welcome. We currently have a small secretariat in Leipzig, Germany, that's financed by the German government, and we focus on biodiversity change. So I won't get into too much detail on this, but of course, with any global network, you really have to think carefully about how you're going to organize the work. So as mentioned, we have a secretariat in Germany. I co-chair the program with Dr. Enrique Pereira, who is based in Germany at the secretariat. We're both in our second 3-year term. So as a chair or co-chair of GEO BON, you're allowed to do a maximum of 2 3-year terms. So we were both elected in 2014 and re-elected in 2017, but we expire next year. So we'll be looking soon for a new chair or chairs for GEO BON. And we have a fairly strict and organized government structure to make sure that all regions around the world have a say in this. So we have an implementation committee that meets quarterly. We also have an advisory board. But the bulk of the work actually happens in our working groups and our bonds, our biodiversity observation networks. So the easiest way to say this is that the working groups are organized around what we call our 6 essential biodiversity variable classes, so ecosystem structure, ecosystem function, species population, ecosystem services, genetic traits, and species traits. And they work on more of the theoretical aspects of how do we actually structure biodiversity observations and scale them. So what are the essential variables for biodiversity? What are the minimum set of independent measures that we need to understand and predict change in biodiversity? And they also work on workflows and tools and more practical aspects, but their job is really to tease out the essential biodiversity variables and how they will be generated and how the data will be managed and how the workflows will work. And then on the other side of it, we have what we call our bonds, our biodiversity observation networks. And these are what we call the engines of GEO BON, because these are operational networks. And I'll get into those a little bit later in more detail. But they're really our ground networks that are actually collecting data and are working with us to pilot the essential biodiversity framework and its concepts. And by piloting it, learn by doing and improve on how we actually structure observation systems. And we've recently added 3 new working groups. So we have genetic composition, species traits, and community composition. So we basically are firing on all cylinders now with GEO BON, where we have groups around the world working on all these different aspects of the dimensions of biodiversity. So another way to look at this, and this picture or slide is something that Miguel Fernandez, who is the coordinator of Pulse of the Planet series, created. But what we'd like to do is really focus on how we can actually structure and build sustainable observation systems. There's a lot of examples of biodiversity monitoring programs that have come and gone. And I'm as guilty as anyone of creating some of those. And over time, we've learned that there's a lot of different sort of pitfalls or things where you can fall down when you develop an observation system. And the first one is that in many cases, scientists are really good at coming up with great ideas of how to monitor and observe a particular ecosystem, but they don't always think about who's actually needing the data, who needs the information, what are the policy drivers, what are the big questions that the funders want or what the governments want. So what we do now is we structure with our bonds a very sequential process for designing and implementing an observation network, where we first ask the question, what are the policy drivers and goals where you need biodiversity data? We then work with the local existing networks to identify what existing data already exists. So start with working with that, but also identify where the gaps are and come up with the most efficient standard ways to actually collect biodiversity observations. We work with some of the key partners, such as the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF, as well as the Ocean Biogeographic Information System, OBIS, to curate data and improve that through the development of new data standards. And we work with different labs and partners to produce model-based outputs from this data, such as biodiversity change indicators and other predictive models. And we deliver that information into various different systems, such as through the Biodiversity Indicators Partnership, which is coordinated by the World Conservation Monitoring Center, and through different data visualization tools that NatureServe actually has developed. And all these different tools and approaches are put into an online platform called BON in the Box, which I'll talk about in a minute. So just quickly on this, we've developed or codified a 9-step process for developing a biodiversity observation system. This was developed through actual examples of work where we've been able to develop sustained observation systems. For instance, in the Arctic, I used to chair something called the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. And this was essentially the process that we went through, where we started with engagement, where we interacted with the decision makers, the funders, the politicians, as well as the local communities to ask, what is it that you need? What are the questions that you need answered? What are the things that keep you up at night? And we use those questions and those policy drivers as a filter by which we would design an observation system. We would then go into an assessment process where we look at what do we already have in terms of data, tools, and platforms to work from. And then we go into design. So how do we actually build the major components of the monitoring systems? What are the essential biodiversity variables? What primary observations are needed to generate those variables? How do we conceptualize ecosystems? What's our understanding of how they function in terms of food chains and processes and energy flows? And what are the critical parts of those systems that we actually need to monitor? What's the most efficient way we can do this? Once that's been developed, we go into data collection methods, so choosing standardized approaches for collecting data, creating sampling frameworks, and also planning for data management, analysis, and reporting. A lot of observation programs often forget to budget for this, and so they're great at coming up with the initial idea of what to monitor, and they go out and start monitoring. But later on, you've got all this data, and you actually have no budget or capacity to do anything with it. So we really focus on all parts of this 9-step process going through to implementation. So just to profile some examples of our network's outputs and products, on the data collection side of things, some of our partners have developed global butterfly monitoring standards. We've published the GEO Handbook on Biodiversity Observation Networks. We've created source books for monitoring tropical forests using remote sensing techniques. And we have a number of other different products, such as how to monitor invasive species, how to actually set up national observation systems in different parts of Asia Pacific, and how do we actually structure and use remotely sensed data to track biodiversity from space. I've already mentioned this, but a sort of a core brand of GEO BON is something called the Essential Biodiversity Variables. What we've done here is, in many ways, we've copied the climate community. So the climate community, of course, has the Global Climate Observing System. They've been able to model the Earth's climate system, and through that, they've been able to identify what they call the essential climate variables. I would argue that climate is easier to model than the biosphere, just by its very nature. It's basically a physical system, whereas the biosphere involves many other different processes and interactions. But we are trying to get down to identifying what are the minimum set of measures that are complementary to one another that can capture the major dimensions of biodiversity change. So as mentioned, we focus on genetic composition, species population, species traits, ecosystem structure and function, and community composition. So we sort of occupy the space between raw data and indicators to create flexible frameworks where you can produce global data sets on things like species population abundance using raw data from a number of different sources that might have used different methods. And through that, using this structured data and these model-based outputs to produce indicators that can be used to drive policy and inform policy. As mentioned, we've been working with some of the key global biodiversity data folks, such as GBIF and OBIS and IDIV in Germany. And this is an example of Darwin Event Core. So this is an extension to Darwin Core that captures, with Darwin Core captures basically species occurrence. With Darwin Event Core, we can now actually capture metadata and information on effort so that we can actually start to go beyond presence-only data to actually get a better understanding and capture and curate data on species quantities and frequencies. All of our EBV working groups are working on what we call workflows. So how do you go from designing an observation system? This is an example for species populations, to creating field data collection protocols, to processing and managing the data and publishing that data, to actually adding value to that data through integrated model-based outputs leading to reporting and indicators. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We have an online platform on the GEO BON website called Bon on the Box. It's in several different languages, so Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English. And what this is basically an online platform where you can search for biodiversity observation tools around data collection, data management, data analysis, and reporting. So what we wanted to do here was acknowledging that there's people all around the world trying to solve various aspects of how do you actually monitor biodiversity or create an indicator. And when I was tasked with developing the Arctic program, I wished that there was a system like this where I could have gone and instead of creating my own data management system and coming up with my own data protocols, I could have just gone to an online system and searched out what are the latest, greatest techniques and methods for collecting and curating and analyzing biodiversity data. So Bon Box is simply a repository, a search-based sort of Amazon-style system where you can actually find the latest, greatest tools, techniques, and protocols. And the whole idea here is that we want to lower the threshold for a country or an organization for building or enhancing a biodiversity observation system. So by making all these different tools and models available, we believe that people will start to choose the same ones and we'll start to get what we call interoperability, where different organizations around the world are basically using and following the same standards. And by doing that, we can actually roll up data. And just quickly on this, another product or tool that's in development right now is something called the Essential Biodiversity Variable Data Portal or Spatial Browser. And so by 2020, we hope to fully launch this, where you can actually view existing data sets that are global and regional in nature through the lens of the EBV classes, and then you can actually download and extract this data and integrate it with other data layers to generate model-based outputs. And as mentioned, a number of the GEO BON partners are working on what we call next generation biodiversity indicators. And these are actually, most of them are now part of the Global Biodiversity Indicators Partnership. So they serve to help track some of the ACHI targets, such as target 5 around loss of habitats and target 12 around species populations. But they're also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll just give you an example of one. This is from the CSIRO in Australia's lab, where they integrate Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF data records with remotely sensed data products, such as the Global Forest Change data set, to infer over time changes in the quality and quantity of habitat for assemblages of biodiversity species. So this is just something that they've developed, and we being NatureServe and WCMC have put up on our BIP dashboard. So this is an interactive dashboard where you can visualize these indicators at national, regional, and global scales to look at trends over time. So in this case, we can look at Ghana to look at trends since 2000 in the Biodiversity Habitat Index and visualize that in graph and map form. But we can also then downscale that to show basin level data. So this is showing an example of one region of Ghana where we can look more specifically at the change in the Biodiversity Habitat Index over that time period. And finally, moving on to the core, sort of what we call the engines of GEO BON. Now this map just shows the different observation networks that have been endorsed by GEO BON to date. That's not to say that these are the only places where people are collecting biodiversity observations, because of course we're seeing biodiversity observation efforts all around the world. But these are the networks that are in place that we actually have formally endorsed and we work with very closely. So we have the Arctic BON. We also have a Biodiversity Observation Network forming in Colombia and in France. There's actually 2 interrelated observation systems that are highly advanced in China. And we also have a regional network called Asia Pacific BON, working across 15 countries in that part of the world to coordinate biodiversity observations. We also have a number of thematic bonds. So we have the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, which is funded by a number of different US agencies, including NASA and NOAA. We also have a global freshwater bond, and we recently launched a new soil bond, which is a global effort to actually monitor and measure soil biodiversity over time around the world. And it's probably worth mentioning that just 2 weeks ago, we formally announced that a new regional biodiversity observation network called America's Bond. So this is a coordinated observation system that will be built all the way from Patagonia to Alaska and points in between through North, Central, and South America. Dr. Miguel Fernandez, who's on this call, has been a big part of getting this going and building some of the key players into this effort. So we've got organizations from all over the Americas that have agreed to work together to basically create a coordinated observation system to better inform and drive smart conservation policy. And this is just a screenshot of some of the organizations that are involved in America's Bond, and that includes my organization, NatureServe. And very soon we'll actually start to roll up our sleeves to look at how we get this concept off the ground and turn this into an operational network. So finally, hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of what GeoBon is, who we are and what we're trying to do and how we're going about it. We started as a concept in 2006. We kind of went through the storming phase where we had spent a lot of time arguing about how we're going to actually structure our work. But now I feel that we're getting into the implementation phase where we're starting to see operational networks form, and we're really starting to fine-tune a lot of the products and tools and approaches. This is a monumental task. It's never ending. There's no sort of goalpost where you say you've done it and you're good to go. But we have the people and the networks and a lot of the tools in place to really build this robust, extensive, and interoperable biodiversity observation network. And by 2025, we do have sort of a mid-range, medium-term strategic plan that has a number of key performance indicators around where we want to be with the essential biodiversity variables and where we want to be with observation networks. And finally, as part of that, the Convention on Biological Diversity is currently negotiating what we call the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So this would be the new global agreement or new deal for nature that takes the world towards 2030 and targets there. And GeoBon's pushing very hard that we have a target around biodiversity observations, because right now, all the targets that we currently have are fundamentally limited by the lack of good quality biodiversity observation data. And we really feel this needs to be recognized by the nation states, that they need to invest in structured observation systems so that we actually can track biodiversity in a smart way and predict future issues before they happen. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions, but thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mike, so much for a wonderful presentation, very enlightening. We will open the floor now for questions from the audience. You could either ask me to unmute you by raising your hand, or you could type your questions on the chat window or in the questions and answers section. All right, we have a question. One quick second. I'm not fully familiar with this system. This is the first time we're using this for Pulse of the Planet, so just one quick second. Okay. Go ahead, Alfec, with your question, please. You need to unmute your microphone. I already, okay, while you do that, I'm gonna read one of the questions we have from the audience. What is the relationship between GEO BON and NatureServe. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's strong connections between NatureServe and GEO BON. Some of them are institutional in that I am the director of the Biodiversity Indicators program, and so and of NatureServe, and I'm also the co-chair of GEO BON, and Miguel Fernandez, who's coordinating this call, of course, is our Latin American Caribbean coordinator. So a lot of the folks that are heavily involved in GEO BON from an early start actually just by chance are part of NatureServe. But it goes a bit deeper than that, because NatureServe is essentially a data and technology and science NGO for driving biodiversity conservation policy. And so everything NatureServe does is done through a network approach, where we have what we call element occurrences, where we have structured ways to monitor and measure biodiversity observations in Canada and the US. And we're working with Miguel and partners in the Latin American Caribbean network to come up with more structured ways to monitor observations in that system. So in some ways, you can almost think of NatureServe as a core subset to GEO BON. It's a key player in the Americas for structured data collection on biodiversity and producing products and tools for conservation outputs, which is part and parcel, a mirror image in many ways of what GEO BON's trying to do globally. And Miguel, of course, please add to that, because it's just as much a question you can answer. Miguel, you're muted.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. Thank you so much for that answer. I was just saying that while we could have the people and the social aspects of a biodiversity observation network, we can also have developed the scientific aspects. A key aspect to connect these two elements is also the funding. And what we're trying to do, replicate this at the regional scale in the Americas, is exactly that connection. The social, scientific, and financial aspects via the Americas BON. And this is just the beginning. So I expect that you will hear much more in the coming months about this initiative that is being coordinated by NatureServe. Okay, Tefek, please go ahead and with your question. You're unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me clearly now?
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Yeah, like I said, I'm talking from Beijing, China here. So I would like to know if you have a program for early career scientists like me who would like to utilize your data, especially if you have data of biodiversity of what grass.
I think we might have
land on biodiversity, and I would like to progress on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Taufik. You cut off a little bit there, but I think I got most of your question. But jump in and tell me if I'm missing it. But in terms of programs for early career researchers and scientists, we don't have a specific program around that, other than in our working groups and our bonds, we strongly encourage that early career scientists and researchers are part of it. So what we don't want is, sort of what typically often happens, where you have late career scientists that have the time and the bandwidth to operate in these networks, and then they all retire at once. So we push sort of on a daily basis to actually encourage and make sure that we have a diverse representation from all regions of the planet, but also different ages, because I fully agree that we need to have that early career element into this so that we can actually build you and others into the program. And on the data access, the best way to go with that, of course, is that we, for the most part, don't hold or own the data. We work with partners that curate data, such as GBIF and others. And so through our bonds, what we do there is we encourage and promote use of existing data systems and structures such as GBIF and OBIS, so that data is all freely available. If you need help in identifying or navigating any of that, please let me know. I just realized I probably didn't include my email in the presentation, but maybe we can share that with you after, because there's many ways to get involved. You can contact me or the Secretariat with specific issues that you need help with. But you can also actually join one of our working groups or bonds. And Taufik, if you're in Beijing, I strongly encourage you to reach out to Dr. Xu Haigen from the Nanjing Institute of Environmental Sciences, or Dr. Ma Kepping, who runs the other Biodiversity Observation Network, who's at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And I can also help connect you if you don't already know those folks.
Okay, thank you, Mike. We have another question from, one second, I'm unmuting the next person. Besek Simeon, you are now unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question, please. Okay, well, we'll wait for the next question. I will read the next question to you, Mike. Does GEO BON play a role in updating or checking the Darwin event core? I wonder if there is an ongoing thought for future uses of data needing different standards for metadata. Thinking about all the info that is missing with museum specimens, event core must address this, but I guess should be open to be updated.
Actually, Miguel, I mean, this is a bit unorthodox, but I think you might be even, do you want to answer that one? I think you would probably give an even smarter answer than I could on that.
Absolutely. So,
always.
So by no means. There is a interesting, I would point you to a website. It's the Biodiversity Standards Working Group. And the acronym is inherited from a past name of this organization. Is the TADWIG, TDGW. I can send you this via email, but this organization, it's volunteer basis, and they are working, trying to create standards for biodiversity data. And they're working on multiple aspects. And one of those aspects is the taxa time-space aspect, which is currently covered by Darwin Core. But there is so many other types of biodiversity information currently being produced. Camera traps are producing data, remote sensing, it's spitting out terabytes of information. They are also working on those aspects. And I would encourage you to connect with this community. Actually, they are getting together in the Netherlands in October for a meeting. And probably there will be a lot of interesting outputs coming out of this meeting. I would encourage you to visit the Biodiversity Next website, where most of the outputs from this meeting will be posted. Thank you for that question. If there is any other questions from the audience, I can read another question. Just raise your hand so I can unmute you. One question is, thank you for the BON in the box explanation, but I feel that you can have parallel developments if you allow, I'm trying to read this question, if you allow the user to choose tools from BON in the box without having any filters.
So I think I'll do my best to answer that question. So yeah, with BON in the box, and it's actually one thing I forgot to mention is we're at the end of November, we're going to be launching what we call BON in the box 2.0, which is a sort of updated version of the system. But the way it works is you actually have to use, well, actually it's not true, but what we encourage a user to do is to actually search for different tools by selecting or deselecting different filters. Whether you're looking for a tool around a certain EBV class, such as species population, whether you're looking for a data collection protocol, say for butterflies, or if you're looking for more of an analysis output. So we sort of try and structure the system. It's a relational database underneath, so that we can actually make that search a little bit more intuitive for you. And it's a little bit structured like the Amazon website. So when you go onto Amazon and say you buy, I don't know, a tent, whenever you're actually putting something in your cart in Amazon, it will suggest other products that it thinks you might be interested in. The same way with Bon in the Box is that we track use of the system to start to find relations between different tools. So we start to suggest if you're selecting a certain tool that'll work well with this other tool. And the final thing, which may or may not answer your question, is that we're really focused on delivering bundled toolkits. So we recognize that a lot of users of Bon in the Box, some of them might want to just go quickly in there and find like the latest, greatest protocol for monitoring migratory geese or something like that. But others actually might want more of a bundled set of tools that work well together, so that, say they want to create an amphibian monitoring program in a tropical region, then you would be able to go on there and actually extract a bundled set of tools that can speak to each other, that take you from data collection all the way to data analysis and outputs.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? You can either type your questions on the question and answer window, or you can use the chat indistinctively, or raise your hand and I can unmute you. In the meantime, I have a question myself. So Mike, this is something that has been always in the back of my head. If you could make an analogy to the climate community in terms of monitoring, what is the stage of our biodiversity efforts to create this community that will track biodiversity? And what would be one key element that we need to focus our efforts in order to move this initiative, the Global Biodiversity Monitoring Initiative, forward?
Yeah, great question. Well, it's tough because, you know, the climate community has the World Meteorological Organization. They have a global climate model that they can use to sort of very easily identify the core elements or variables that you need to actually inform that model, and therefore be able to monitor, predict, and track climate. And we don't have that. And we also don't have that sort of global authority that sort of structures everything we do. It's a crowded and really messy landscape in terms of the biodiversity world. And I would say that even within the country I'm in Canada, there's a lot of different government agencies that have ownership or a mandate around biodiversity data collection. And because of that, it's really, really difficult. But I would, if I understand your question correctly, Miguel, you know, we're way further behind than the climate community in terms of being able to actually structure global observations and be able to produce useful outputs and models and predictions. To me, there's a number of reasons for that. One is just the absolute nature of biodiversity data being so complex. I really think that we need to look at the nature scenarios modeling exercise that's coming out of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES, where we're actually starting to slowly move to a more model-based understanding of how their systems work. And through that, I think that does give us some opportunities to start to get our act together through a bit more of a sort of scientifically rigorous model-based approach. So I really look at that as sort of one key element that we can soon more fully take advantage of to structure biodiversity data collection.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer, Mike. Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? You can raise your hand if you want to be unmuted and ask the question yourself, or you can type the question on the window. All right. Well, Mike, thank you so much. This was a wonderful presentation, very enlightening to know and learn all the efforts that GEO BON has all over the world and the connections that you are making in Latin America, across the Americas via NatureServe. This is excellent. I want to reiterate my gratitude to all the attendants and the people who have registered. If you know someone who is interested in this presentation, our recording will be made available on the website, on the NatureServe website and the GEO BON website, perhaps Monday or Tuesday. Give us a couple of days, but it will be eventually available. I also invite you to see past presentations from other presenters. They are there. And if you have any questions or if you want to give a presentation, send me an email. Thank you very much, Mike, again.
Yeah, well, thanks to everyone that attended. I really appreciate your time and hopefully found that useful. And I put my email in the chat box, so please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any other questions that you want me to try and answer.
Perfect. Thank you so much again, and have a wonderful weekend, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you again. This is Pulse of the Planet. Thank you.
Thanks, Miguel.